The Duke of Withycombe returned to England on a Tuesday. He did so without fanfare, without a single liveried carriage sent ahead to announce his arrival. 4 years of war on the continent had stripped from Gideon Sinclair any taste for ceremony. He rode a plain, hired horse through the lanes of Marley, the town that bordered his estate, and felt the familiar damp chill of home seep into his bones. He had left a duke, a name, a title tied to a portfolio of assets. He returned a man, all hard edges and quiet fury, with a scar that traced the line of his jaw like a cold tributary. He expected to find Withycombe in ruins. The reports from his solicitors had been growing more dire for 2 years, revenues dwindling, tenants leaving, the house itself falling into a state of genteel decay. He had been bled dry from a distance, a casualty of mismanagement and, he suspected, deliberate fraud. What he did not expect, as he crested the final hill and saw the great stone house emerge from the mist, was the sight of it whole. The roof was sound, every slate in place. The windows were not shattered and boarded, but clean, catching the weak afternoon light. Smoke curled from a dozen chimneys, a sign of life and warmth within. As he drew closer, he saw the fields were not fallow, but plowed in neat, dark ribbons, ready for winter wheat. The fences were mended, the stone walls, once crumbling, were repaired. It was not the Withycombe of his youth, opulent and bustling. It was something leaner, quieter. But it was alive. It was solvent. He dismounted in the courtyard, his boots crunching on fresh gravel, and a stable boy, a lad he did not recognize, ran to take his horse with a respectful tug of his forelock. The great oak doors opened before he reached them, and a woman stood there. She was not old, perhaps 25, dressed in a simple gray wool gown of impeccable cut, but no ornament. Her brown hair was pinned in a severe knot. Her face was pale, intelligent, and utterly devoid of the welcome he might have, in another life, anticipated. She was not a servant. There was an authority in her stillness that belied her plain attire. "You are unexpected," she said. Her voice was low and steady. "I am the master of this house," Gideon replied, his own voice rough from disuse. "I need no invitation." He stepped past her into the hall. It was cold, the stone flags gleaming under a merciless polish. But it was not the cold of neglect. It was the cold of economy. There were no lavish bouquets, no fires roaring in the great hearths, only a single branch of autumn leaves in a ceramic jug on a side table. Everything was clean, cared for, but stripped to its essence. "Where is the Duchess?" he demanded, turning to face her. The woman's expression did not change. Not a flicker of surprise, not a hint of fear. "I am the Duchess," she said. Gideon stared. He had a memory, a dim one, of the proxy marriage, a political and financial necessity brokered by his man of business and the girl's family, the Lockharts, who were teetering on the edge of disgrace. He had seen a miniature once, a blushing, pretty girl with blonde ringlets and a vacant smile. That was Rosamond Lockhart. He had been told, in a brief, dry letter, that a substitution had been made at the last minute. The elder sister, Prudence. He had not cared. He was marching on Lisbon. A wife was a signature on a document, a placeholder for a dynasty he had no interest in founding. This pale, severe woman was that signature. "You," he said, the single word an indictment. "Yes," Prudence replied, her hands clasped loosely before her. She did not flinch. "I have managed in your absence." Managed? The word was a raw sound in the quiet hall. My solicitors speak of ruin, of debts. Your solicitors receive their reports from my aunt, Lady Arabella Devereux, and her factor, Mr. Fletcher Garrick, she stated, as if reciting a page from a textbook. I would recommend you review the actual accounts, not the ones they have prepared for you. He followed her, his stride long and angry, to the study. His father's study. Here, too, was the same austere order, the scent of beeswax and old paper. She did not go to the grand mahogany desk where the official estate ledger lay, its gilt edges thick with dust. Instead, she knelt by a low bookshelf and retrieved a different book. It was a simple, cloth-bound volume, its cover frayed at the corners. He saw, as she placed it on the table between them, that one of the corners had been meticulously repaired with tiny, perfect stitches. She opened it. The pages were filled with a neat, precise script, column after column of figures, notes in the margins, dates and names. It was a record of every penny, every bushel of wheat, every bolt of wool Withercombe had produced in the last 3 years. This is the truth of the estate, she said. She did not say, this is what I did. She did not say, I saved this place. She simply presented the evidence. Gideon looked from the book to her face. He had expected hysterics, pleas, perhaps even a fawning welcome from the woman who bore his name. He had braced himself for a battle with a simpering fool or a conniving shrew. He was not prepared for this quiet, unyielding competence. He saw the ink stains on her right index finger. He saw the faint lines of weariness around her eyes. And for the first time since he had set foot back on English soil, the cold knot of fury in his gut loosened, replaced by something else, something sharp and unsettling. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. It was curiosity. Who did this? He asked, his finger tapping the perfectly repaired corner of the ledger. The book was my father's, Prudence said. He taught me accounts. The cover was damaged when the roof of the west wing leaked 2 winters ago. I repaired it. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were a currency her aunt, Lady Arabella, disdained, and a luxury Prudence herself could not afford. She had been the Duchess of Withercombe for 4 years, and for all of that time, she had been a ghost. The marriage had been a transaction, a cruel piece of arithmetic. Her family, the Lockharts, possessed a name but no fortune. Gideon Sinclair, the newly ascended Duke, possessed a vast fortune but was bound for war and required a wife to secure his line and manage his affairs through his solicitors. The original bargain had been for her beautiful sister Rosamond, but at the last moment, Lady Arabella, their guardian since their parents' death, had made a chilling calculation. Rosamond, with her beauty, was an asset to be married into a title that was present, not absent. A pretty face was wasted on a proxy. Prudence, plain, quiet, and possessing a mind for numbers deemed unwomanly, was disposable. And so it was Prudence's name that was entered on the marriage certificate. Prudence, who became a duchess in a cold church, with the Duke's solicitors standing in for the groom. Her life at Withercombe began not as a duchess, but as a prisoner of her own title. Lady Arabella installed herself in the dower house, and, with her man of business, the unctuous Mr. Fletcher Garrick, took control of the estate's finances. They saw Withercombe not as a home to be nurtured, but a quarry to be mined. Prudence was the key. As the Duchess, her signature was occasionally required, her presence a legal necessity. But she was given no power, no funds, no authority. She was instructed to remain in her rooms, to read, to sew, to be invisible. The staff were told to report to Mr. Garrick. The grand rooms were shuttered, the silver packed away, the staff dismissed until only a skeleton crew remained. Lady Arabella's explanation was one of wartime economy. The truth was one of systematic theft. They sold timber, leased land at disadvantageous rates to their own cronies, and submitted falsified account books to the Duke's solicitors in London, painting a picture of an estate bleeding money while they lined their own pockets. Prudence endured. For the first year she watched in silence. She walked the cold halls, her footsteps echoing. She ate her sparse meals alone in the breakfast room, served by a grim-faced housekeeper named Hannah, who saw her as another mouth to feed. But Prudence had not been raised to be idle. Her father, a country gentleman with more sense than coin, had loved his land. He had walked it with her, taught her the names of the grasses, the signs of blight in the wheat, the feel of good soil. He had taught her how to keep accounts in the frayed ledger she now treasured, believing a woman should understand the mechanics of her own security. That knowledge, long dormant, began to stir. The turning point came during the first winter. A fierce storm tore at the west wing, and rain poured into the library. Prudence, woken by the sound, found the remaining servants huddled in the kitchen, helpless. Mr. Garrick was in London. Lady Arabella would not answer a summons in the dead of night. Water was destroying priceless books, ruining the plasterwork. Prudence did not panic. She organized the small staff, directing them to move the books, to place buckets, to cover the furniture. She climbed onto the roof herself with the stable master, in the howling wind and rain, to secure a tarpaulin over the gaping hole. The next morning, when Mr. Garrick returned, he chastised her for her unladylike behavior. He refused to pay for a permanent repair, claiming the estate lacked the funds. That was when Prudence understood. They were not just negligent. They were actively willing the house into ruin. From that day on, she began her quiet rebellion. She used the small personal allowance the marriage settlement afforded her, a pittance her aunt had not dared to touch, to pay a local tiler directly for the roof repair. She began to speak with the tenants, listening to their grievances about Mr. Garrick's raised rents and broken promises. She started her own ledger, cross-referencing the household expenses she could track with the pathetic sums Mr. Garrick claimed were available. She discovered he was selling the estate's wool at a fraction of its worth to a merchant in Marley, a merchant who, she suspected, was in his pocket, while claiming the market was poor. She found a different buyer, a guild of weavers in a nearby town, and arranged, through a sympathetic tenant farmer, to sell a portion of the flock's wool to them directly. The money from that secret sale paid for seed, for fence repairs, for medicine for a sick child in the village. She did it all invisibly. She used no title, no authority she did not possess. She used only her father's name, Lockhart, on the contracts. P. Lockhart. A steward. A manager. The Duchess of Withercombe was a ghost, a legal fiction. But P. Lockhart was real. P. Lockhart was mending the fences, buying the seed, and slowly, painstakingly, holding the estate together. The household staff, who had first seen her with suspicion, began to watch her with a grudging respect. Hannah, the housekeeper, started leaving a hot brick wrapped in flannel at the foot of her bed on cold nights. The stablemaster began asking for her opinion on a lame horse. They did not call her Your Grace. They called her Miss Prudence. It was a name that felt more real, more earned than the grand title she had never wanted. Her life was a careful, exhausting balancing act, a secret war waged in columns of figures and quiet conversations in rainy farmyards. And then, the Duke came home. Gideon Sinclair did not move from his position, leaning against the mantelpiece, his gaze fixed on the ledger. He had been home for 3 days, and in that time, he and Prudence had spoken fewer than 100 words. An accord had been reached, not through discussion, but through a shared, tense silence in the study. He would observe. She would continue her work. He was a thundercloud contained within the walls of the house, a dangerous, unpredictable pressure. Prudence felt it every moment, a tightening in her shoulders, a need to keep her hands perfectly still. He was not the man she had imagined, if she had allowed herself to imagine him at all. The miniature had shown a handsome, arrogant youth. The man who had returned was harder, colder, stripped of all softness. The scar on his jaw was a testament to a violence she could not comprehend. But it was his eyes that were most unsettling. They were a pale, flat gray, and they missed nothing. "Explain this," he said, breaking the silence. His finger rested on the line in her book. "Sale of 30 stone of fleece to the Minster Weavers' Guild. Mr. Garrick sells our wool to a merchant in Marley for 2 shillings the stone," Prudence said, her voice even. "He claims it is the best price to be had. I learned from a tenant that the Minster weavers were paying 3 shillings and 6 for the same quality. I arranged a private sale of the wool from the high pasture flock. The proceeds paid for the new drainage tiles in the north field." "The sale was in your name? Lockhart?" "Yes." "Why?" It was a simple question, but the answer was a knot of 4 years of humiliation. "Because the Duchess of Withercombe has no standing," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "According to my aunt and Mr. Garrick, she is a silly, sequestered creature who understands nothing of business. Her name on a contract would invite questions they do not wish to answer. But a P. Lockhart, a factor, a steward, he is invisible. He is plausible." Gideon's eyes narrowed. He was beginning to see the shape of the trap she had lived in. A cage with gilded bars. She had his name, but no access to its power. They had used her as a shield while they plundered his estate. And she, with no resources but her own mind, had fought back. "They will know I have returned," he stated. It was not a question. "Lady Arabella and Mr. Garrick are expected this afternoon," Prudence confirmed. "They believe they are coming to meet with your solicitor to finalize the sale of the South Woods." "There will be no sale," Gideon said, the words like chips of ice. "They will not be pleased." A humorless smile touched his lips, barely disturbing the line of his scar. "I am rarely concerned with the pleasure of thieves." He looked at her then, a long, assessing gaze. "They will try to discredit you, to remove you." "They have been trying to remove me, in spirit, for years," she replied. "It will be no different." "It will be different now," he said, and there was a finality in his tone that made the air crackle. "Because I am here." He pushed away from the mantelpiece and walked to the grand desk. He picked up a pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and held it out to her. "Show me the letters you have written as P. Lockhart. Show me the contracts. Show me everything." A strange pact was forming between them, unspoken and undefined. It was not the bond of a husband and wife. It was the alliance of 2 strategists surveying a battlefield. He needed her knowledge. She, for the first time, had an ally with the power to act. He proposed the terms that evening as they sat in the study with the ledgers spread between them like a map of their shared territory. "My solicitors will be informed that all estate business is to be referred directly to me," he began, his voice low and devoid of emotion.
Lady Arabella's authority is revoked. Mr. Garrick is dismissed. That is the public face of it." He paused, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "In private, you will continue as you have been. You will be my steward. You will report only to me. We will work together to unravel this network they have built."
"In return," he continued, "you will have the full and public protection of my name. No one will question your position in this house again. You will be the Duchess of Withycombe in fact, as well as in name." It was a business proposition, cold, clear, and transactional. There was no mention of affection, of duty beyond the practical. He was offering her a shield, and in exchange, he would use her as his sharpest weapon. Prudence felt a tremor go through her, a dizzying mix of fear and, to her astonishment, exhilaration. For 4 years she had been a shadow. He was offering her substance. "And my aunt?" she asked. "Your aunt," Gideon said, a dangerous glint in his eye, "will be given enough rope to hang herself." The confrontation happened sooner than she expected. Lady Arabella Devereux arrived in a flurry of expensive silk and indignation, with Mr. Garrick trailing in her wake like a plump, malevolent shadow. She swept into the drawing room, which Prudence had ordered aired and warmed, a fire crackling in the hearth for the first time in years.
"Prudence! What is the meaning of this? The servants are saying the Duke has returned, without a word to me. It is an outrage, an insult to my position."
Lady Arabella's voice was high and sharp. Before Prudence could answer, Gideon stepped out from the shadows near the window. He had not bothered to change from his plain riding clothes. He looked severe, powerful, and utterly indifferent to her aunt's performance. Lady Arabella stopped short, her mouth forming a small O of surprise. She recovered quickly, her face rearranging itself into a mask of sycophantic welcome.
"Your Grace! What a delightful surprise! We were not expecting you. Had we known, a proper welcome would have been arranged."
"I am not here for a welcome, madam," Gideon said, his voice cutting through her flattery. "I am here to take possession of my property. Mr. Garrick," he said, shifting his gaze to the sweating factor, "your services are no longer required. You will vacate your cottage by the end of the week. My solicitor will settle your final wages." Garrick paled, sputtering. "But, Your Grace, the accounts, the South Woods sale—" "There is no sale," Gideon stated flatly. "And as for the accounts, I find them unsatisfactory. My wife has been keeping a much more accurate set of books." He gestured almost imperceptibly towards Prudence, who stood silently by the fireplace. It was the first time he had called her his wife in front of anyone. The word hung in the air, a solid, tangible thing. Lady Arabella's eyes darted to Prudence, and for the first time, Prudence saw not just disdain, but a flicker of genuine fear in her aunt's gaze. The game had changed. The pawn had suddenly acquired a king.
"Your wife?"
Lady Arabella laughed, a brittle, unpleasant sound.
"Your Grace, you mustn't be deceived. Prudence knows nothing of the world. She is a simple, fanciful girl. Her books are a child's scribblings. She cannot be trusted with such matters."
Gideon took a step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Lady Arabella," he said, the words dropping like stones into a deep well. "My wife saved this estate, while you and your creature attempted to gut it. She did it without my name, without my help, and without a single word of thanks. From this moment on, you will afford the Duchess of Withycombe the respect she is due. Is that understood?" Lady Arabella stared,
her face a mask of fury. She had lost control, and she knew it. With a strangled noise of outrage, she turned on her heel and swept from the room, Garrick scurrying after her. The room fell silent. There was only the sound of the fire. Prudence stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had defended her. He had called her his wife. He had acknowledged everything she had done.
She looked at him, standing tall and unyielding in the center of the room, and felt a crack appear in the careful wall she had built around her heart. It was a terrifying, brilliant fissure, letting in a light she had not realized she had been missing. The days that followed settled into a new, strange rhythm. The quiet transformation of Withercombe began in earnest. With Gideon's authority behind her, Prudence's plans, once secret and small-scale, became estate policy. The tenant farmers, who had long trusted Miss Prudence, now found their trust validated by the Duke himself. Rents were adjusted to fair levels. The corrupt middlemen were bypassed. Wagons bearing the Withercombe crest, freshly repainted, began to travel the road to Ewminster, laden with wool and grain, returning with coin that went directly into the estate's coffers, now managed from Prudence's meticulously kept ledger. The house itself seemed to breathe again. Rooms were opened, dust sheets removed. The scent of beeswax and lavender replaced the smell of damp and disuse. Hannah, the housekeeper, now took her orders from Prudence with a smile, her gruffness melting away to reveal a fierce, protective loyalty. She began preparing meals she remembered the old Duke enjoying, consulting Prudence in low tones about Gideon's preferences. Prudence, who knew nothing of her husband's tastes, would simply say, "Prepare what you think best, Hannah. Let us make him feel he is home." Gideon was a constant, silent presence in this revival. He and Prudence spent their days in the study, a space that had become their shared domain. He would sit for hours, reviewing the old, fraudulent accounts of Garrick and comparing them to the stark truth of Prudence's ledger. He spoke little, but his questions were sharp and insightful. He was learning the shape of his own home through her eyes, through the story told in her columns of figures. She, in turn, learned the shape of him. She saw the way he held his left shoulder, a lingering ghost of an old injury. She noticed he drank his tea black and unsweetened. She saw that, while he never smiled, a certain stillness would come over him when he looked out the window at the land, a quiet that was not empty, but full of a deep, weary attachment. One afternoon, she looked up from her work to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. "You enjoy this," he said. It was not a question. "The numbers. The order." "My father believed a woman should be able to balance her own accounts," she replied, her pen pausing over the page. "He said it was the only true independence." "Your father was a wise man." Gideon looked down at the ledger. "My father believed a duke's only duty was to increase his own consequence. He would have despised this level of detail. He would have called it shopkeeper's work." "And you?" Prudence asked, her voice quiet. He was silent for a long moment. "In the army," he said finally, his voice low. "A miscalculation in supplies by a single day can mean the death of 100 men. A leaky canteen, a rotten barrel of biscuit. These small details are the difference between life and death. I have learned to value shopkeeper's work." It was the most he had ever revealed of himself, a brief, stark glimpse into the world that had forged him. She saw then that his coldness was not a lack of feeling, but a shield forged in a place where feeling was a liability.
They were not so different, she and this hard, quiet man. Both had learned to survive by mastering the details, by finding power in the precise and the practical. Her own quiet transformation was happening in the small, forgotten corners of Withercombe. One morning, she found herself in the walled garden. It had once been his mother's pride, but it was now a wilderness of weeds and thorns. The rose bushes were choked and leggy, their blossoms small and pale. On an impulse, Prudence fetched a pair of shears and a set of old leather gloves.
She began the slow, patient work of cutting back the deadwood, of clearing the weeds from the roots of the struggling plants. She remembered her own mother in another garden long ago, showing her how to make the cut just so, above the bud, to encourage new growth. The work was hard, her back ached, but as she cleared the earth, she felt as if she were clearing something tangled within herself. She was not just reviving a garden. She was claiming a piece of this house as her own, not through a title, but through care. Gideon's perspective. He watched her from the library window. She was on her knees in the dirt of the ruined rose garden, her brow furrowed in concentration, a smudge of earth on her cheek. Her plain gray dress was protected by a rough canvas apron. She looked nothing like a duchess. She looked like a woman at work, and in the late afternoon light, with her hands buried in the soil of his mother's garden, she was the most real thing he had seen in years. He had returned to England a hollow man. The war had taken his youth, his friends, his capacity for easy feeling. Betrayal had done the rest. Before he had left, the woman he had thought he loved, a society beauty of impeccable breeding, had sold his military plans to the French for a handful of jewels. He had discovered it just in time, but the knowledge had frozen something inside him. It had taught him that beauty was a mask, the charm was a weapon, and the trust was a fool's game. He had agreed to the proxy marriage with a cynical shrug. A wife was a necessity, a name on a page. He expected to find at Withercombe another vacant face, another grasping hand hidden in a silken glove. He had found Prudence. He thought of her in the study, her head bent over the ledger, her brow creased not with worry, but with calculation. She spoke of crop yields and drainage tiles with more passion than any woman he had ever known had spoken of jewels or gowns. It was not passion, he corrected himself. It was certainty. He thought of the way she had faced him down in the hall on his first day, her gaze steady, her voice calm. She had not been afraid of him. She had not been impressed by him. She had simply stated facts. He thought of her quiet order to the housekeeper. "Let us make him feel he is home." She had not done it to please him, he knew. She had done it because it was the proper, decent thing to do. It was part of her quiet, relentless restoration of order. He looked back at the garden. She was tying one of the old rose canes to the wall, her movements careful and precise. She was mending his home. She was mending his finances. And in the process, she was, piece by piece, mending something in him. This quiet, plain, ferociously competent woman who was his wife. The realization settled in him, not with a crash, but with a slow, deep certainty, like a foundation stone settling into the earth. It was not pity he felt for her, or even gratitude. It was a profound, unnerving respect. And it was beginning to feel dangerously like something more. He had built walls of ice around his heart,
and Prudence Lockhart, with her ink-stained fingers and her quiet determination, was melting them without even trying. He turned from the window, a strange, unfamiliar tightness in his chest. The ghost of Withercombe was becoming the keeper of his soul, and he was not sure if he was terrified or saved. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The quiet truce at Withercombe could not last. Lady Arabella Devereux and Mr. Fletcher Garrick, deprived of their illicit income, were not creatures to accept defeat gracefully. Their first move was a campaign of whispers. In the drawing rooms and market squares of Marley, stories began to circulate. The new Duchess was an eccentric, a recluse who preferred the company of servants to her own kind. She was mad, spending her days digging in the dirt like a common laborer.
Worse, it was hinted that her mind had been unsettled by her husband's long absence, that the Duke's return had only exacerbated her strangeness. Prudence felt the change in the averted eyes of the shopkeepers, the sudden silences when she entered a room. She ignored it. She had endured 4 years of invisibility. A little slander was of no consequence. Gideon, however, did not ignore it. He began to accept invitations to dinners and assemblies with the local gentry, events he would normally have scorned, and he insisted Prudence accompany him. Their first outing was to a dinner at the home of Sir John Corbett, a neighboring landowner. Prudence dressed in a simple dark blue silk, a gown she had made herself years ago. It was hopelessly out of fashion. She wore no jewels, save for the thin gold wedding band on her finger. When she descended the stairs, Gideon was waiting. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her plain attire, and for a moment she braced herself for a criticism, a command to change into something more suitable for a duchess. "You are ready?" was all he said. "Yes." "Then let us go." The evening was an ordeal. The women, in their bright silks and feathered turbans, eyed Prudence with a mixture of pity and contempt. Her beautiful, flighty sister Rosamond was there, holding court in a corner, surrounded by a coterie of admirers. She spared Prudence a brief, condescending nod before turning back to her audience. Lady Arabella was in her element, moving through the room like a spider spinning a web of innuendo. "Poor dear Prudence," Prudence overheard her saying to a group of ladies. "She has no taste for society. The Duke is so patient with her, but one fears for the Withercombe line. She is delicate." The men were worse. They spoke to Gideon of politics and war, their eyes sliding past Prudence as if she were a piece of furniture. Mr. Garrick, bold in his resentment, approached Gideon with a false air of concern. "A word of advice, Your Grace, as a friend. You must watch your wife. Her management, it is unorthodox. Selling assets without proper consultation, it is a dangerous path." Gideon's response was lethally quiet. "Mr. Garrick, my wife's management has saved my estate from your proper consultations. If you value your reputation, I would advise you to stop speaking of matters you no longer understand." He then turned his back on the man, a dismissal so absolute it was like a slap in the face. He sought out Prudence, who was standing alone near a wilting potted palm. He did not offer her his arm. He simply stood beside her, a silent, formidable guard. His presence did not make them like her, but it made them fear him. And for now, it was enough. The opposition, however, was escalating from slander to something far more dangerous. The true attack came not in a ballroom, but in the sober setting of the Marley Town Council. where Gideon had been invited to sit as the district's largest landowner. Mr. Garrick, in his capacity as a town elder, a position he had purchased with Withercomb's money, requested to address the council on a matter of urgent public concern. Lady Arabella and Rosamond were seated in the small public gallery, their expressions a study in feigned gravity. Prudence sat beside Gideon at the long table, a sheaf of papers before her, her hands resting calmly on top of them. Garrick began with a long, rambling speech about the duties of landowners, the sanctity of property, and the dangers of mismanagement. Then he went in for the kill. "It is with a heavy heart," he said, his voice oozing false regret, "that I must bring to this council's attention a matter of gross malfeasance at the Withercombe estate. Certain valuable assets, namely a parcel of ancient woodland, have been sold without the Duke's knowledge or consent by a party acting under his name." A murmur went through the room. Gideon sat like a statue of granite, his face expressionless. "I have here," Garrick announced, pulling a document from his coat with a flourish, "a bill of sale for the High Beeches wood, sold to a timber merchant for the sum of £500. The money was paid in cash and has since vanished. The document is signed by the party responsible." He held it up. "It is signed Prudence Sinclair, Duchess of Withercombe." He passed the document to the head of the council, a florid, self-important man named Mayor Drummond. The mayor examined it, his eyebrows rising. "The signature appears to be genuine," he pronounced, looking at Gideon with a mixture of accusation and relish. "Your Grace, this is a most serious allegation." All eyes turned to Gideon. The air in the room was thick with suspense. This was the moment the whispers had been building towards. The mad, incompetent Duchess had finally been caught, her thievery exposed. Lady Arabella leaned forward, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Rosamond looked bored, as if the outcome were a foregone conclusion. Gideon did not look at the document. He did not look at the mayor. He looked at Prudence. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She met his gaze without a tremor. The entire room, the accusations, the hostile faces, all of it seemed to fade away until there was only the space between them. For a single, terrible second, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not suspicion, but the ghost of an old, deep wound. The memory of another betrayal, another woman's treachery. The wound of war and faithlessness that he carried within him. It was the moment of crisis, the fracture point where everything they had built could shatter. He did not need to speak the question. She saw it in his eyes. The room held its breath, waiting for the explosion, for the Duke to denounce his wicked wife. Prudence leaned forward slightly. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the taut silence with perfect clarity. "Ask me," she said. The command was so quiet, so unexpected, it stunned the room. She was not speaking to the council. She was speaking only to him. "Ask me plainly," she repeated. Gideon's gaze held hers. The flicker of doubt in his eyes vanished, extinguished by the force of her unwavering stare. He had seen men lie under fire. He had seen them dissemble and betray. He knew the look of guilt. This was not it. This was the look of hard, unvarnished truth. He turned his head slowly to face the mayor. "I have a question for my wife," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. He turned back to Prudence, the public forum transformed into an intimate space for two. "Did you sign this document?" "No," Prudence said. The word was simple, unadorned, absolute. Gideon nodded once, a short, sharp gesture of acceptance. He turned back to the stunned counsel. "There you have it," he said, his voice like chilled steel. "My wife did not sign it. The document is a forgery. And Mr. Garrick," he added, his eyes fixing on the now panicked factor, "is a liar and a thief." The silence in the room broke. Garrick began to bluster, shouting about evidence and witnesses, but his voice was shrill with panic. Lady Arabella's face had gone slack with shock. The trap had not only failed to spring, it had snapped back on the one who set it. Prudence felt the tension leave her body in a slow, silent wave. He had trusted her. In front of them all, he had chosen her word over the seemingly damning evidence. He had looked into the abyss of his own past betrayals and chosen to believe in her. She looked down at her hands, resting on the papers before her. They were perfectly steady. She had not needed to present her evidence, her ledgers, her proof. Her word had been enough. The thought was so overwhelming, so profound, it left her breathless. For the first time, in this cold, hostile room, under the weight of a false accusation, Prudence Sinclair felt something akin to being safe. The foundation of their reluctant alliance had been tested by fire, and it had held. It had become something stronger. It had become trust. The public accusation required a public refutation. Gideon understood this. It was not enough to declare his wife's innocence in a council meeting. The stain of slander had to be scoured away before the eyes of the entire county. The instrument of this reckoning came from an unexpected quarter, the Dowager Countess of Yardley. A formidable old woman with eyes as sharp as a hawk's and a tongue to match, she had been observing the drama in Marley with keen interest. She had known Gideon's mother and had no love for the grasping ambitions of Lady Arabella Devereux. 2 days after the council meeting, an invitation arrived at Withercombe. The Dowager Countess was hosting a grand ball at her estate, Heron Court, to celebrate the Duke's return. The entire county would be there. It was not a request. It was a summons to a battlefield. "She is choosing a side," Gideon said, holding the thick, cream-colored card. "Or she is merely curious to see the slaughter," Prudence replied, a hint of dry weariness in her tone. "Either way, we will not disappoint her," Gideon said. A grim smile touched his lips. "It is the perfect stage." In the weeks leading up to the ball, a quiet, intense energy filled Withercombe. Messengers rode back and forth to London. Prudence and Gideon spent their evenings in the study, not with ledgers, but with letters, deeds, and maps of the estate dating back 100 years. They were preparing not for a party, but for a trial. Prudence felt a strange partnership solidifying between them. They moved with a shared purpose, often understanding each other with no more than a glance. He would ask for a specific date of a tenant agreement, and she would produce the document from her files without a moment's hesitation. Her memory, precise and ordered, was their greatest weapon. The night of the ball arrived, cold and clear. Prudence stood before the long mirror in her bedchamber, dressed in a gown of deep emerald green velvet. It was not a gown she had made. Gideon had had it made for her by a London modiste who had come to Withercombe for a secret fitting. The dress was simple, elegant, and perfectly cut, its rich color bringing a warmth to her skin and a depth to her serious eyes. Hannah had insisted on dressing her hair, her gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle as she coiled it into a soft, low chignon, leaving a few tendrils to frame her face. For the first time in her life, Prudence did not feel plain. She felt armed. Gideon was waiting for her at the foot of the stairs. He was dressed in formal black evening wear that emphasized his height and the severity of his handsome, scarred face. He watched her descend, and his expression was one she had never seen before. The coldness was gone from his eyes, replaced by an intense, unguarded admiration. He did not speak. He simply held out his hand. She placed hers in it. His grip was warm and firm. It was the first time they had touched so deliberately, hand in hand. Together they went out into the night. Heron Court was ablaze with light. The ballroom was a sea of jewels and silks. As the Duke and Duchess of Withercombe were announced, a hush fell over the assembly. Every eye was on them. On him, the returned war hero, formidable and remote. And on her, the scandalous, mad Duchess, now appearing poised and elegant in her emerald gown. Lady Arabella, holding court near the orchestra, watched them with a venomous glare. Mr. Garrick stood beside her, his face flushed, his confidence bolstered by the public setting. Rosamond, beautiful in pale pink, looked at her sister with frank astonishment, a flicker of something that might have been jealousy in her eyes. The Dowager Countess of Yardley sailed towards them. "Your Grace," she said to Gideon, her voice a gravelly rasp, "you have been away too long." Then she turned her sharp gaze on Prudence. "And you, madam, I have heard a great deal about you." "I am sure you have, Lady Yardley," Prudence replied, her voice calm. The old woman's lips twitched. "Good. A woman should have a reputation, so long as she controls the narrative." She tapped Gideon's arm with her fan. "The stage is yours, boy. Do not make a hash of it." The moment came after the first dance, a quadrille which Gideon and Prudence danced with stiff, formal grace. As the music ended, Gideon did not lead her from the floor. He held her hand and raised his other for silence. The orchestra trailed off, the chatter died. 200 pairs of eyes fixed on them. "I thank you all for your welcome," Gideon began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the vast room. "I have been absent for some time, and in my absence, rumors have taken root regarding the management of my estate and the conduct of my wife." A collective intake of breath. Lady Arabella smiled, sensing her victory was at hand. "I am here tonight to address these rumors, plainly." He released Prudence's hand and took a step forward. "It has been claimed that my wife has mismanaged my affairs, that she has acted without authority and to the detriment of the estate. I have here," he said, and one of his footmen stepped forward, handing him a familiar, frayed ledger, "the truth. This is a record, kept in my wife's own hand, of every transaction, every penny earned and spent at Withercombe for the past 3 years. It shows an estate not in decline, but one rescued from ruin by her intelligence and her tireless work." He opened the book, but did not read from it. "It shows how she, alone and unsupported, found new markets for our wool when the old ones were being exploited. It shows how she paid for repairs from her own small allowance when the estate coffers were being deliberately emptied. It shows a woman holding back a tide of corruption with nothing but her own integrity." He then turned his gaze on Fletcher Garrick. "And it exposes the lies of the man who sought to ruin her. Mr. Garrick claimed the estate was failing. These books prove he was the one failing it, siphoning off its profits for himself. He claimed my wife forged a bill of sale. I have here a sworn affidavit from the timber merchant in question, who admits he was paid by Mr. Garrick to create the document and lie about its origin. And I have here," he said, as another man, a small, bespectacled gentleman, stepped forward, "Mr. Simon Ellery, a handwriting expert from London, who will attest that the signature on that forgery bears no resemblance to my wife's hand, but a striking resemblance to Mr. Garrick's. The collapse was total and immediate. Garrick stood frozen, his face the color of putty. All around him, people turned away, their faces masks of contempt. Lady Arabella tried to rise, to speak, but the Dowager Countess of Yardley turned to her and said, in a voice loud enough for all nearby to hear, "I do not believe we are acquainted, madam." It was a social execution, swift and brutal. Lady Arabella sank back into her chair, her face a ruin. The ballroom was utterly silent, stunned by the public demolition. But Gideon was not finished. He turned back to Prudence, who stood watching him, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. He walked to her, and the crowd seemed to melt away, leaving them in a circle of light. He did not look at the stunned faces of the gentry. He looked only at her. "The marriage contract that made us husband and wife was a matter of business," he said, his voice softer now, but still carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "A convenience, a name for a name. I was wrong." He went down on one knee. A gasp went through the ballroom. A duke on his knee, not to a queen, but to his own wife. "It was not a contract for a name," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "It was a contract that gave me a person of more worth and substance than any title, any estate. A person I did not deserve, but who I have come to admire more than anyone I have ever known." His voice was raw with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Prudence, my wife, will you have me? Not as a signature on a page, not as a guardian of your position, but as your husband, in truth." Tears, the tears she had refused to shed for 4 years of lonely endurance, welled in Prudence's eyes. They were not tears of sorrow or humiliation. They were tears of overwhelming, shocking joy. She looked down at this hard, honorable man who had seen her when no one else had, who had valued her for her mind and her strength, who had just defended her and claimed her in front of the entire world. She gave a small, tremulous smile, a genuine smile that transformed her serious face, making it luminous. "Plainly," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes." He rose, and taking her hand, he brought it to his lips. Not the back of her hand, in the formal gesture of the ballroom, but her palm, pressing a kiss to the center of it, a gesture of profound intimacy and devotion. The silence of the room was broken by a single, sharp sound. The Dowager Countess of Yardley, tapping her fan against her hand in a gesture of emphatic approval. Then, the rest of the room, as if waking from a trance, erupted into applause. Prudence saw her sister, Rosamond, in the crowd, her face a mixture of shock and a dawning, grudging respect. She saw the tenant farmers Gideon had invited, standing at the back of the room, their faces beaming. She saw Hannah, who had insisted on coming, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her apron. But mostly, she saw Gideon. His eyes were fixed on her, and in their gray depths she no longer saw the coldness of war or the shadow of betrayal. She saw a home. She saw a future. The Duke had returned expecting a battle for his estate. He had found one, but not the one he'd anticipated. He had waged a war for his wife's honor, and in winning it, he had won his own heart. The ghost of Withercombe was gone. In her place stood the Duchess, chosen and cherished, ready to begin her life at last. 1 year later, the Withercombe Rose Garden was a riot of color and scent. Deep crimson blooms stood beside pale, creamy whites and soft, blushing pinks. The air was thick with their perfume, mingling with the smell of warm earth and newly cut grass. Prudence sat on a stone bench under the south-facing wall, a small open book resting in her lap. She was not reading. She was watching her son, Abel, a sturdy toddler with his father's serious gray eyes and her own determined chin, as he carefully patted the head of a large, patient wolfhound who lay at his feet. Withercombe was thriving. The house was filled with light and warmth, the sound of servants going about their work with cheerful efficiency, the laughter of a child echoing in the long corridors. The fields were green and lush, the tenants prosperous and content. The name Sinclair was once again synonymous not with decay, but with integrity and good stewardship. Lady Arabella had retired to Bath in disgrace, her social standing shattered. Mr. Garrick had disappeared, rumored to have taken ship for the Americas. Rosamond had made a surprisingly sensible marriage to a country baronet, and in her letters to Prudence there was a new, more thoughtful tone, a quiet admission of her own past foolishness. It was not a full forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Gideon came into the garden, walking not with the stiff, guarded posture of the soldier he had been, but with the easy stride of a man at peace in his own home. He came to the bench and sat beside Prudence, his shoulder pressing against hers. He did not speak, simply followed her gaze to their son. After a long, comfortable silence, he reached out and took the book from her lap. It was not a book of poetry or a novel. It was a new estate ledger, its leather covers smooth and unblemished, its pages crisp and white. He opened it to the title page. In her beautiful, precise script, she had written, "The Estate of Withercombe." Gideon took a pen from his waistcoat pocket. He uncapped it, and beside her words, he wrote, his own script, strong and bold. "Managed by the Duke and Duchess Sinclair." Then he looked at her, a question in his eyes. She smiled, took the pen from his hand, and after his words, she added one more, the ink flowing in a dark, definitive line. "Together." He closed the book and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the cover. He thought of the first time he had seen her, a pale, severe woman in a cold hall. He thought of her frayed, mended ledger, a testament to her lonely, defiant competence. And he looked at her now, his wife, the mother of his son, her face softened by happiness, her eyes full of a love that was as steady and true as she was. The war had taken so much from him, but it had, in its own cruel way, led him home. Not just to Withercombe, but to her. He lifted her hand, the one with the plain gold band on its finger, and pressed a kiss into the palm, just as he had in the ballroom a year before. A promise made, a promise kept, plainly and forever. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.